Well, again, once again, welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm your host again, Linda Kurtz with Go Green Wilmette. During tonight's webinar on composting, we'll learn why it's so important to keep organic materials out of landfills and how composting is one of the best solutions to do that. Plus, we'll learn about the many other benefits that it provides. We have a great group of speakers tonight, and I'm really grateful to each one for joining us tonight to share their knowledge and experiences. So, thank you again to all of our speakers. We'll hear from an expert in the industry on composting basics. We'll review the local rules in Wilmette regarding composting and yard waste. And then we'll hear from local experts on how they manage their organic materials through composting. So to start us off, I'm pleased to introduce Erlene Howard, who is the founder and owner of Collective Resource Compost, or CRC. This is a food scrap company that's based in Evanston that really seeks to mitigate climate change by recovering organic resources through commercial composting. So in 2010, Erlene started this business literally out of her vehicle and literally hauling one compost bucket, one 5-gallon compost bucket at a time. So today, CRC owns a fleet of sprinter trucks. They service thousands of customers, and they have diverted 7,550 tons of material out of the landfill and into composting. So it's really quite remarkable. So Erlene also serves on the board of the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition, which is a non-for-profit organization that brings together stakeholders from all aspects of the commercial composting industry in Illinois. And so with that, Erlene, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Linda. I am really excited to be here tonight. And thank you so much for having me. And why would all these people come together to talk about composting? And I think the main answer to that is it's really going to be making a difference in our air quality. And it really has a lot to do with getting carbon out of our atmosphere and methane. So why, yeah, right? If you put the food in the landfill, it gets covered up and compacted, and it doesn't have the correct environment to break down naturally. It ferments, it creates methane, and it creates pollution and continues to affect our planet warming up and warming up and warming up. If we get the food scraps out of the landfill, then we get the opportunity to turn it into a reusable resource, to amend the soil, grow healthier plants, have more water retention in our soil, and to have better air quality. So there is like no downside to getting the food scraps out of the landfill. So we're going to encourage you tonight to think about how it's going to work in your household to get your food scraps out of the landfill. We're going to talk about backyard composting, and we're going to talk about the yard cart program in Wilmette, and there are other yard cart programs throughout the North Shore. And so that's important to check out. And then throughout Chicagoland, there's the opportunity to compost with Collective Resource. And so I'll kind of walk through the layers of that. So in your backyard, there's a limited amount of things that you can do. You really want to stick to what we call pre-consumer waste. So not necessarily your food scraps after you've made the food, but your peels and cores and things prior to making your food. But depending on what you're going to do with your compost, it also you may have other limitations of what you want to put into your compost pile. Then with Wilmette's compost yard cart program, you sign up, and with that program, you can put all fruits and vegetables in it, and your eggshells. And so that can be, that can include things like leftover fruit salad, or salad that's gone bad, or, a number of things along that way. But we'll hear more about that from Wilmette experts. And then when it comes to a container swap program like Collective Resource, we take anything that was once alive. It can be meat, dairy, bones, fish skin, moldy, burnt, cooked, not cooked, you know, anything that you're not going to eat. We want you to put it in the bucket so we can take it and make compost out of it. So we work with all types of properties. If you are, if you're in a single family home, uh, you may, depending on the size of your family, get a 5-gallon bucket picked up every other week. If you live in a condo building or you want to encourage your neighbors to compost communally with you, we have our Neighbor Totes program. So you would get a 32-gallon tote, and then educate a group of people. Generally, 24 people will fill up a 32-gallon tote in a week. But if you have 12 people, obviously you can have it picked up every other week. So once I learned about composting, I just had to do it. And actually, 11 years ago today was the very first time I drove around in my Toyota Camry and picked up food scraps. And I spent about 9 months or so doing the food scrap collection in my car, and then got my first truck and got my son to work with me. And now we have 22 employees, and we do a lot of education. We're very involved in Chicagoland. We love opportunities like this to really help people think about how they can get their food scraps out of the landfill. Yeah, so anyways, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm excited to hear about the other programs and look forward to any questions that you might have for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Arlene. I have one question for you that I'm going to ask right off the bat and not save it for the Q&A. Can you explain to us a little bit how the differences between how your compost is processed such that you can put in, meat and
Oh,
bones and
sure.
things like that versus like what you might do in your backyard?
Yeah. So the material that goes into your yard cart and the material that we collect in the container swap program, they they go into great big piles called windrows. Most of the composting in Chicagoland is done in windrows, and these piles are huge. They are literally 18 feet wide and 9 feet tall, huge mounds, football field long. And so they actually cook inside. The carbon nitrogen reaction makes the food scraps cook, which is different than most yard piles. Even though the compost is breaking down, there might be a small amount of the nitrogen carbon reaction, but most yard piles don't get hot. And that getting hot is what's really important for breaking down um, the meat and dairy and making sure that there's nothing left in the compost that's going to make you sick from those things.
And then one last question, and again, we'll save the rest for the end. What happens to that finished compost from those fields?
Yeah, so there's a lot of uses. One thing that we did this spring is we had a compost gift back. So our customers came and collected part of it for free. We had a limit on how much was free, but they also had opportunity to buy more to to do in their yards. But also huge projects like the landscaping around the 606 trail or any major Illinois Department of Transportation project that would get done. All of that landscaping that happens around those major projects come from these large commercial composting sites. So yeah, and Scott's Lawn Care, they buy the material to mix into their products because a seed that's planted with compost has an 80% higher germination rate than a seed planted without compost. So I'm going to say one more interesting thing. If you aerate your lawn like once a year, and then you put a layer of compost on your grass will start to retain much more water. It'll be a lot easier to keep weeds out of it, and it won't require as much watering to stay green and healthy. So it'll be much more resilient to hot weather.
Wow, that germination fact is amazing. I thought that, and Beth does as well. Well, thank you for sharing all that. I mean, I think your story is so compelling too. The fact that you recognized the damage, so to speak, to the environment that occurs from food waste that gets into landfills, and you really, for you, it spoke to you, and you said you had to do something about it, and so you founded this company. So really inspiring. I imagine we'll have a lot of questions about, how do you get the right mix of green matter and brown matter and whatnot. But I know Mike will address some of that as well. And again, we can come back to those questions at the end. So Erlene, thank you so much. Really informative. And again, it shows us why composting is so important. So next up, we have our very own Kate Amoruso to review the local ordinances relating to composting and the curbside yard waste collection program in Wilmette. Now, for those of you that are on that may not be from Wilmette, this information may not be 100% applicable, but I urge you to go check your own town or village's ordinance to see what kind of programs and rules might be in place. So Kate is the assistant to the Director of Engineering and Public Works, and she's had a number of different positions within the village and has worked for the village for a while. And she also has a degree in landscape architecture and thus is well suited to be talking to us about compost tonight. So Kate, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Linda. Thank you so much for having me today. I am going to share my screen really quickly here. All righty. So as Linda mentioned, I'm first going to touch really quickly on just some of our backyard compost pile regulations. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not a code enforcement officer. So this is kind of, a very just cursory overview of our actual ordinance. But just in general, it's what you would expect, grass trimmings, yard waste, leaves, weeds, and just general garden waste. We do not allow any sort of garbage or, meat scraps, pet waste, obviously, because that would, in a residential setting, attract a lot of container, and that container just has to be equal to the height of the compost pile to prevent all of the materials from blowing away. We do have to cap the size of the compost piles to 100 square feet, and they just have to be less than 5 feet tall. And then in general, they do have to be kind of, for most homes in Wilmette, we would say they have to be at least 3 feet from the lot line. It is required that they be in the backyard, no front yards or side yards, no easements. For the larger properties, it may be a larger than 3 foot setback, but it would be no less than 3 feet from the lot line. And we also do offer like a curbside program for organics. This is pretty much an expansion of our existing yard waste program, which has existed for many, many years. So in addition to regular yard waste, in 2019, we started accepting things like bread and grains, fruits and vegetables, eggshells, dairy, non-liquid dairy, coffee grounds, tea bags. Those are the two sizes that we do offer, the 35 gallon and the 96 gallon containers. Those containers are free to rent for Wilmette residents. So if you are interested in the program, you do need one of those containers in order to compost the food scraps. If you're just going to do yard waste, you don't necessarily need that. You can just keep using the brown paper yard waste bags. But if you're going to have food waste, we do want to contain that in these containers. Now, this was kind of what you're seeing on the screen right now was the general rules implemented in 2019 when we first started this program. It was what we kind of call the vegetarian program. So we couldn't do meat, we couldn't do any poultry or bones, no liquids, no fats and oils. And even though they're marked as compostable, we couldn't do any compostable serviceware, and certainly no compostable plastic bags. These unfortunately are marked as compostable, but they just don't break down fast enough in the commercial compost setting. So we've gotten reports from our haulers that they'll end up with a bunch of perfectly usable compost and a lot of mixed in plastic bags. So just because it's marked as compostable does not necessarily mean that it is. Just similar to recyclable, if it's if it's marked as recyclable, it's not necessarily recyclable in your curbside program. So just be sure to check our website, and you can always call us at Public Works if you have any questions with that. Now, I do have kind of an exciting announcement that is really new. So this is not something that we've put out yet on social media, but it's coming soon. That with waste management now taking over our program from advanced disposal, we've actually expanded significantly the items that we can accept in that curbside program. So they are perfectly fine taking meat, poultry, and seafood. Bones, that's completely fine too. They're totally acceptable of the compostable serviceware. And my next slide will go into it a little bit more, but the fats, oils, and grease, that's as long as they are not liquid, those are fine as well. So this is the full list that will be going out soon and putting up on our website of acceptable and not acceptable items. So this is, I think, probably more in line with what Collective Resource accepts, which is great. And it'll certainly expand, the items that we can take, and also hopefully cut down on some of the confusion too between the two programs. But basically, waste management will accept all solid food leftovers. So, including the meat and poultry, just everything that's pretty much not liquid. We just can't accept liquid. And we now will accept the greasy pizza boxes, the paper towels, the napkins, and any uncoated paper serviceware. We do still have to, limit the no plastics, no compostable plastic bags. That's definitely still off the table. And we did mention this before. These are those windrows that the compost is put in. And those are those giant piles. This is where all of it ends up. It's turned regularly, and the compost that is collected in Wilmette is resold in a commercial setting. So that is not available directly to residents. All right, that's all I have, Linda.
All right, thanks so much, Kate, and thank you for that sneak preview. That's really exciting. I'm excited about that. Yep. And it's great to know that Wilmette ordinances support backyard composting, and of course about the collection, the curbside collection program. And with that, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and quickly share my experiences, because I use the curbside collection program. So I am going to share my screen really quickly.
Yep.
And I just have a few pictures just to kind of illustrate what I do here. So for me, the curbside collection program, I find to be very easy, and it works really well for me. So you can see the kinds of things I'm collecting in the picture on the left. It's banana peels, orange peels, there's an eggshell in there, some other vegetable type materials. I keep this when I'm collecting things on the counter, but I then put it on top of my refrigerator when I'm not, actively collecting in it. And, 2 or 3 times per week, I'll empty that into my toter. So you can see I've got this is the 32-gallon toter here. And, when I do need to have this picked up and I take it to the curb, I do have to put that sticker on. And each time they do take the sticker off. So I feel reasonably confident that the folks that are picking this up are actually taking it, for compost, because I see someone get out of the truck and take the sticker off. So for me, what I do is, I'll dump my food waste into the toter along with any yard waste that I may have. You can see here's a picture, there's some yard waste in there and the contents from that bucket. And then I keep the toter in my detached garage. So I have a garage that's not connected to the house. I store it in there along with my other containers. And I've never had any issues with odor. When I lift the lid, it might be a bit of an earthy smell to it, but, nothing really offensive or that emanates from the container. I've also never had a problem with animals trying to get into the garage or the toter that I'm aware of. Now that I learned I could expand potentially what I put in there, I could see issues with odors if I let that sit for too long. But that would be, I think, a way, just something about managing it weekly. I will admit that I don't take this to the curb every week. I kind of wait for it to get full. And in the summer, that can vary depending on how much yard waste I'm generating. But what will happen is, the material will start to break down because, I'll see the volume decrease, and, I can keep putting more and more in, if you will. And I will share with you that I do this in the winter as well. So even when the yard waste collection program ends for the year in November, I keep putting food waste into this all winter long. Now, I am just a one-person household, so, I'm not generating obviously as much as a multi-person household might be. But again, for me, I've never filled one of these up over the course of a winter. Again, the volume will decrease over time because there is some action that's taking place. In the really cold months like January and February, not much is happening there, but, it does start to break down. Then in April, when the program starts up again, I'll take it to the curb, get it, and have it picked up. I will admit, I do rinse this out a few times per year, especially after the first time it's been picked up. But generally that water, I try to minimize the amount of water I'm using, but then I use that water in my flower and vegetable and native plant beds because it's got some good stuff in it. So this is one option that, again, wanted to share my experiences there on how that works. So with that, I would like to transition then into our next speaker, who will share another approach, which is to use a collection service, as we've heard Erlene mentioned. So we have Junia Hedberg with us, who will review how both she and many of her neighbors use a service for their kitchen scraps. Now, Junia has a background in science and education, and she's always been very interested in the environment. In fact, she serves on the green team of her local church and has brought composting to her condominium building. So we'll hear how Junia's journey for that. And, this is such a great way. And Junia is really a believer in this because, again, this shows how the actions of one person or a few people can really make a difference. So Junia, if you'll take us through your composting solution now.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I hope we'll work on that. Yeah, so I'm talking about composting in apartment buildings. And hold on just a second, I've got to get to the next slide. I'm sorry. That's fine, but you want to see more than just that. So let me see what I can do. There we go. This is my building. I live at 1440 Sheridan Road in Wilmette, just across the street from Plaza del Lago. I'm the president of the board at the present time. And several years ago, we decided that to save our pipes, we needed to get rid of our disposals in our kitchen sinks. And so all of them were removed at the cost of the owner, and it wasn't very expensive. We got a very good deal from a plumber. And then we thought, well, what are we going to do now? And we had to get rid of things because people were putting things like tinsel and other things down the drains and in the disposals, and it was just terrible. We had to rot out our pipes about 3 or 4 times a year. And now we do it maybe once or twice a year. It's so much better. But we decided that we would compost, and most everybody in our building is doing that now. We go with Erlene's program with the collective resource. It's wonderful that we have a bin in the garage, and I'll show you what we do. On my kitchen counter, I have this holder, and I put anything that ever lived. And I love the way that we've talked about that already. It can be bones, it can be eggshells, things that we could not ever put down the disposals. It's leftover food, a paper towel with some grease from a pan. Anything can go into that. And until recently, we did use those quote unquote compostable bags, but we were told that those get in the way of the machinery, so we don't use that anymore. And so we found other ways of collecting this. Some people collect it in newspaper, or I've seen a few people just collect it as Linda did, in a metal pot, and then just keep it somewhere until they're ready to take it down to the other place. But some people just use an old coffee pot. So there's all kinds of things that you can use, but I use this one. And we go down to the upper level of our garage. We are a condominium, and here is our collective resource tote. It's very easy to get to. It says compost on it. It's very clear. Once a week it is picked up, and we have a keypad on our garage. Somebody, either the garbage people, the recycling people, or the compost people, I don't know which, and it doesn't matter, lost the garage door opener. And so we put a keypad in, and all of them have the keypad number and can get in and take out the garbage, the compost, or the recycling. Each one is a different company. So that works really well. And every Tuesday they come. Erlene sends a message that they're coming every Tuesday, and we know they are. And again, as you said, Linda, the smell is not bad at all. If you lift it up, you can sort of smell it, but when you put it down, it doesn't bother us at all. One of the things I wanted to mention, though, in our sinks, we don't want stuff to go down the sinks. And so I don't know if you can see this, probably not. I got this at Mill and Hardware. It's a very fine grain little strainer that I put in my sink, and then I can just dump the stuff into my compost bucket. But that's much better than what the plumber allowed us to have. So that was really important to us. And then we gave everybody a sheet saying why it's important to compost and what you can compost. And as you've said before, Arlene, anything that ever lived. And that's wonderful, because we're in an apartment building. We don't have backyard composting. We don't have worms. We don't have or anything like that. We just have what we've got. So we can put tea bags or coffee grounds or artichoke leaves. I use a lot of artichokes. I'm from California, so artichokes are really big for me, and they're just horrible to get rid of. So we put them in the compost. And bones, as we mentioned before. We also recycle, and we also have garbage. And I don't want to go through all of this, but I want to point out that when in doubt, throw it out. Because sometimes you say, which of these places am I going to put this? Never plastic in compost. Only certain kinds of plastics in recycling. And when in doubt, just throw it out. But we really believe in composting, and it's wonderful, and we really appreciate all that we can do with that. And we're saving our pipes, and that's terribly important. So that's really all I have to say, and thank you so much for having this webinar.
All right, well, thank you so much, Junia. Your presentation really shows how easy it is and cost effective for everyone living in a multi-unit building to do composting, collectively when everyone gets together on that. So again, another alternative, right? There's composting solutions for everyone. So now I'd like to turn it over to our final speaker for tonight, who will focus on backyard systems. So Mike Zarski is with us tonight, and he's going to take us on a deep dive into his backyard composting systems And you might note that I said systems. I think you'll find it really interesting. Mike is a 40-year resident of Wilmette. He's a very avid gardener. In fact, his yard was on the Go Green Wilmette virtual yard tour last year. So Mike has two different systems he's going to share with us tonight. And he's found that, you know, the compost, of course, really enhances his native plants as well as his vegetable garden. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I do have to issue a disclaimer. I don't consider myself an expert at composting, but I would say that I'm successful at composting because I found a way to keep my food scraps and yard waste out of the landfill and to enhance my garden as well. And I am going to talk about the two systems that I use. The first one is sort of the classic 3-bin system. And then this is a vermiculture system that uses worms to produce the final compost. Now this is our backyard, and we've been gardening here a long time. And so I've established mature perennial plants almost everywhere, mostly native plants. And we also like to grow vegetables. So we grow tomatoes, peppers, greens, and herbs. And that's what really got us into composting. We wanted to get into vertical gardening for our greens and our herbs. And this keeps the plants out of the reach of rabbits and slugs. And it keeps them cleaner because they're away from the ground. And it makes it much easier to tend to them and harvest plants. So we came across a system that uses a tower to grow the plants and incorporates kitchen scraps and worms to provide extra nutrients. And I'll go into more detail about this system a little later. Now we started following the guidelines to make our yard more pollinator friendly and a better habitat for butterflies, birds, and wildlife. And we thought we were doing pretty good already because of all our native plants. But then we learned that we really had to think about providing the right habitat year round and not just during the time of the year that we're outside. So what that means is that all this vegetation doesn't get chopped down and hauled off to the landfill in the fall like we used to do. Instead, the plant material stays in place over the winter and provides shelter and food and a place for pollinators to overwinter or to leave their eggs to hatch in the spring. So by spring, a lot of this stuff has started to break down already. And so it made sense to complete the natural cycle and compost it and return it all to the soil. So this is the 3-bin system that composts the yard waste along with the kitchen scraps that the worms can't handle. It's 9 feet wide, around 3 feet deep and about 3 feet high. It rests on a pad made of cement pavers, and the wood is treated lumber and cedar. The sides and the back are wire screen with a 1/2-inch mesh, and the top is an asphalt roofing material. Now that makes it kind of heavy, but the asphalt is soft, and so it isn't as noisy in the rain as a metal or a fiberglass roofing material would be. And to make it easier to open and close, we did add 2 lid hinges with 40-pound pistons that work kind of like the lifters that open the back doors or the rear doors of an SUV. Now, Sheila and I like doing building projects together, so of course we built this ourselves, and we used about $300 in materials. We had some leftover materials, so we're also able to make a nice little log shed for firewood. And we looked at other people's bins when we were planning our project, including ones at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And we also looked at some at the homes on the Go Green Sustainable Yard Tours, and that was very helpful as well, both to see those and to talk to the people that were using them. We also found some very good plans that online that helped us with this project. Now the front of the bins are made with a series of boards that are removable. And this is a great feature that lets you leave the top front open, as you can see on the left, and lets you use that to throw in weeds or other material without having to lift the lid. Or you can open the bottom, as you see on the right, and you can get at the oldest and most composted material at the very bottom of the pile. You can also see that we put some pavers in front of the bins and also set a path of stepping stones in the area. Now, since we're tossing out kitchen scraps nearly every day, it's nice not to have to walk through mud or dirt to get to the bins. Now, you can also remove all of the front, and that's what we do when we want to shovel out the finished compost in the spring. Now, this part of the bin holds the plant stems from the previous year's growth. And when it all goes in the spring, it's a lot looser and it fills the bin completely. I leave it like that for a couple months just to give any remaining hatching pollinators a chance to get out. And then I crush it down and compress it. I do that by getting into it and just stomping it down, kind of like the way they stomp grapes when they're making wine, except I definitely leave my shoes on when I do that. Now, if all this material is kept moist, it will continue to break down even before it's mixed into the main compost pile. But it can also be used as a mulch. Now, I like the look and the smell of cedar mulch, but there are places in my yard where, like under bushes, where you just can't see the mulch. So it's a good place to use it. And we also will layer the mulch, using this as a base layer and then covering it with the nicer cedar mulch. Now, this saves a lot of money by saving us from having to use the full thickness of mulch with cedar. Now this is my compost collector, and it sits in the kitchen. And by the way, it also makes a great champagne bucket if you're celebrating a promotion or an anniversary. We have another container that we use to throw coffee grounds in, and another one for eggshells. Now, since we've been working from home and eating from home most of the time, we do generate quite a bit of both kitchen scraps and coffee grounds. And I do try to empty this every day. I found one of the benefits of collecting all this moist organic stuff from the kitchen and putting it in a container instead of in the kitchen trash is that the kitchen trash becomes a sort of a wastebasket for the non-recyclable packaging. And it really doesn't need to be emptied that often because things aren't in there rotting and smelling. Now, this is where the magic happens. This is the main compost pile, and it's a mixture of the kitchen waste, some fresh plant clippings and weeds. I don't really have to pull a lot of weeds out of my yard, but I do have some very exuberant native plants like Joe Pye weed, goldenrod, and cup plant that will spread and take over if you don't control them. So I do have to, remove some of those plants. And this just, I'm not trying to generate tons of waste or compost. So this just sits for several months and slowly decomposes. I think as somebody mentioned, you can have a hot compost pile, but mine is not that hot. It takes a lot longer than the several weeks that a hot pile would take to decompose and break everything down. And so one of the benefits, though, of doing it the slow way, the lazy way maybe, is that I don't have to go in there and turn it every week to aerate it to keep oxygen in the pile to keep it hot. It is interesting, though, that if you go onto some of the websites, the gardening websites, people will post a lot of pictures of their piles with thermometers sticking out, showing how hot they can get their pile. It's sort of I guess, a bragging rights thing among serious composters. Now, my pile does get hot in the spring because the kitchen waste accumulates over the winter. It just sits there in a big frozen pile. And so when it finally thaws out, it does get quite warm. Now, when it's not frozen, I use a trowel to dig a little hole and bury the kitchen scraps. And they disappear quite quickly. When everything's covered up, there's really no smell and no flies. Now, we do have wildlife in our area, and nothing has ever tried to show any interest or get into the compost pile. And I don't think the animals would be able to get in even if they tried. Now, here's a recent picture of our compost bin that illustrates sort of the classic greens and browns of composting. The high nitrogen greens are the material on the left, and they get mixed in with the high carbon browns material on the right of the bins. And towards the end of the season, or towards the late summer, I will just throw everything together and finish it all off in one big pile. And then in the spring, it'll be ready to be used in the yard. Now, there's one more thing that I have tried composting, and that's this material. We do have a central vacuum system with a fairly large canister that only needs to be emptied about once a year. And we have wool carpets. So the fiber is organic. And I've tried composting this. It is nasty stuff, and I definitely have to wear a dust mask around it. But once I buried it in the pile, it broke down very quickly. And I'd be very interested or curious to hear if anyone else has tried composting this material. Dryer lint, presumably from your cotton loads, is another thing that I've heard people will try composting from their household. Now, this is where most of the compost from last season wound up, in our raised beds. I always turn over part of the soil from the beds every year. The old stuff gets spread out in other parts of the yard and garden, and the new finished compost is mixed in with garden soil and replaced in the raised beds. Now, compost is a soil amendment. It's not a complete soil, so you don't want to try to grow plants in 100% compost. It does need to be mixed in with soil to get the minerals and other structural materials that soil will provide. Now, this is, well, here's the beds of tomato and peppers that we use them for. And this is the vermiculture system. It's called a garden tower. It's a vertical cylinder that's filled with soil, and the plants grow out of the top and the sides. Then there's a smaller cylinder that runs down the middle. It's perforated, and we fill that with the kitchen scraps and the composting worms, and they produce a very high quality of compost. And this is our system. We use the tower, we use the system to grow greens, salad greens like lettuce and arugula, and cooked greens like collards and mustard, and herbs like basil and oregano. Now, this is a closer picture of the pockets where the plants are rooted. Now, just as an aside, if you look very closely at the parsley on the left, right in the center, you'll see a little thing that looks like a tiny pearl. And that's a black swallowtail butterfly egg. And that egg hatched into this caterpillar, which then morphed into this butterfly. And at that point, we stopped harvesting the parsley and let the butterflies have it for the rest of the summer. Now, here's where the kitchen scraps go in the tower. And you can see that There's some white stuff that I spilled on the right, on the outside in the soil, and that's the eggshells that I powdered in a blender. Now the composting worms need a little grit in their diet, and so I toss in a little eggshell once in a while. Now here are the composting worms. They're a different species than the night crawlers or the worms that you find living in the soil. These worms are also called red wigglers or manure worms, and they live in decomposing material. And I was able to buy these online. Now the bottom of the garden tower has a drawer that collects any drainage from watering. And this water absorbs a lot of the nutrients from the compost as it passes through. So some people call it compost tea, or some people call it worm tea, and it can be poured back into the tower or used to use with other plants, potted plants or other plants in the garden. There's also a tray that slides out, and that allows you to drop the finished compost out of the into the drawer for use. And here is the finished product. It's called worm castings, which is a very elegant term for the stuff that passes through the worms. And it is amazing stuff, even compared to regular compost. The nutrients are all soluble and bioavailable to the plants. And it also contains a lot of beneficial microbes and secretions from the worms. Now, I add the worm castings to a lot of my potted plants, but most of it winds up in the soil around my purple passion flower. This is a native plant of Southern Illinois, Passiflora incarnata. And here it is. I tried growing it in several different places around the yard, but it really only took off when I put it in a sheltered spot around our foundation and amended the soil with worm castings. Now, this is a picture from last year, and I wanted to see what this plant would do if I left it alone, and you can see it really just about totally engulfed our front porch. This year, I'm trimming it back a little bit. And finally, here's some links to some resources that we found very helpful when we were getting into all this. The first one is a link to a PDF that has building plans for several different compost bins, types of compost bins. It's got material lists, instructions for building, instructions for using, and we found that very useful. The second link is to the Garden Tower Project website. That's the system that we use for our greens and has the worms in it. That started out as a like a GoFundMe project, and it's been very successful. And then finally, there's a link to the Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County. They have a lot of really good resources on composting, including one that lists all the regulations and guidelines of all the communities in Northern Cook County. So if you're not in Wilmette, you can look and see what the requirements are for you. And with that, I will end my screen share. And thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike. And of course, to all of our speakers. I, for one, have so many questions for all of our speakers and for Mike as well. But before I jump in with my questions, just a few things to point out. If you look in the chat, you'll see links to the references that Mike talked about, as well as a few others. We will also include these links in the email follow-up that tells you how to find this recorded webinar. So you will get another chance to see those as well. I also want to point out that if you were inspired by Mike's yard, which I know I am, and if you want to see more, you can go to Go Green Wilmette, look for our yard tour, virtual yard tours from 2020, because Mike's yard is featured. So you'll see Mike and his wife talking about their yard. You can learn a little bit more about it. So if you're interested, you can certainly see that. And with that, if you have questions for any of our speakers, please type them into the Q&A. because we will answer those now. Again, I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to let those who are joining us tonight start off first. So with that, I would like to introduce Maria Dabrowski, who is our Go Green Wilmette liaison, and she will help facilitate the Q&A. So Maria, thank you so much for your help.
Thanks.
I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the speakers. Wonderful presentations. I live in Ann Arbor, where I currently am trying to figure out my own composting situation, so I am inspired. All right, so we will begin with a question that is very probably for Kate. Someone asks how we can make sure that the compost is actually going to the compost and not being thrown away or incorrectly disposed of.
I am going to apologize if you can hear my dog right now. His bowl is next to me. Yes, so absolutely, please, if you do see the compost being taken by a garbage truck, absolutely call Public Works. I think my contact information will be posted at the end of this and maybe even emailed out. Feel free to contact me directly. But you can also always just call the General Public Works email or the General Public Works line. We take that very seriously, as does Waste Management. People make mistakes, so hopefully it's just an isolated incident, but that's definitely something that we want to know about so that we can rectify it. I will say that if you are a longtime yard waste user, user of the yard waste program, you will know that the old yard waste cans used to look exactly like the garbage cans, except they had a white sticker with red lettering on it that said yard waste only, but that was on the side of the can. So if you're putting your can next to your recycling can, that sticker is completely invisible. So that being said, that could, like I said, it could just be an honest mistake. They look remarkably like the regular garbage bins, which is why we're trying to get them swapped out with the newer ones with the brown lid, or at least with a sticker on the top of the lid so that it's very clearly identifiable as compost.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, this next question I am thinking is for Mike, which is, do you have to move the compostable piles from one bin to another, or do you just leave them in the bin you initially put them in?
That's a good question. I like to keep them separate until I have the right ratios, or I need to enter them into the center bin, which is the main compost bin. So as I said, over the summer, I'll throw out any weeds I pull or grass that I pull out of the garden, or plants that I have to pull up. Those will just sit in one pile. The browns will sit in the other pile. And then the kitchen waste goes directly into the middle pile, which is where the actual composting is occurring, most of it. But I do like to leave them separate and combine them as needed, so that, because they're not generated at the same rate. And you do need to sort of kind of keep a balance. And then again, I do use some of those brown materials as mulch instead of compost. I mean, it actually does get composted eventually because the mulch breaks down. So that's almost a third form of composting, to use it as mulch. But that's how it works.
That's helpful. Thank you. This next question, I have heard very many different answers about approximate ratios of greens to browns. And so Catherine asks that she understands there should be a certain amount of both in backyard compost. What does this mean? Mike, you feel free to answer, and then maybe Arlene, you can talk about how that works with collective resource. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that the ratio should be 1 part green to 2 part browns, but I can't really say that I have a way of measuring that, because the kitchen scraps are considered a green, but then I also have clippings and things that I throw in that are green, and then I have these browns. So I found that if you do it the slow way, like I do it, and you're just maybe letting the things sit there all one summer and then, the following winter, it'll take care of itself. You can't have an overwhelming amount of browns, I would say, but it will eventually all break down. So if you do it the slow way, I don't think you have to worry so much about ratios. And the way with those bins, you could also have two compost piles going, one a little older that you stop adding to and just let it continue breaking down, and the other one where you're actively throwing your kitchen scraps into. It just depends on what your goals are. If you need a lot of compost in your yard, you're really pushing to amend the soil all over the place. And I am going to try Erlene's tip to throw it on the lawn after it's been aerated. But generating the compost is sort of a secondary thing for me. It's more just keeping all this material out of the landfill. So
Right.
it's just a slower process, more forgiving.
That is very helpful. And I think that what you said is people can be more flexible maybe with their backyard composting depending on their goals. So that's very helpful. Arlene, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so thank you. As Kate showed with the windrows, the large windrows, those comprise mostly of the yard waste and the food scraps that come in. And they are, like Mike said, they're kept separate. So they have aging piles that they keep track of. So they're not putting fresh food scraps into the pile that's ready to be sold. And in the fall, much like what Mike does in the spring, but in the fall, when what comes in the yard carts is mostly leaves, then those get put to the side at the large commercial composting site. And that material gets mixed in with the food scraps and the yard waste throughout the rest of the season. So I'm not the one who's making the piles cook. We take it to a commercial composting site. So I don't have the exact formula, but they do hold back those fall leaves so that they have them throughout the whole season.
That's helpful. Sounds like it's kind of an art and a science at the same time. Junia, question for you. What were the biggest obstacles you faced in getting fellow building residents on board for the composting program?
Inertia. It didn't happen overnight.
Sure.
And there are still some people who don't do it, but most people do. I see a lot of people heading down to the garage when they're going to get into their cars with their compost stuff. Repetition over and over. At board meetings, some people got really tired of me saying anything, and I said, "Here I am again. I hope you're composting." And people would start to nod, and a few would ask questions, but most people went along with it. A lot of people, I understand, would use some of those collectible bags, put them in their freezer, and then when they had a whole bunch of them, they'd go and dump them out in the compost thing later on. So everybody does something just a little bit differently.
And then as a follow-up to that, if you were to do it all over again, is there something you would do differently to try and get more people on board?
I don't know how we could do that. I send emails to people. I mention it at board meetings. We have a handbook for every new resident with all kinds of information, including how to recycle, what to put in the garbage, what out of compost. And we meet with them. And I am always talking about composting and recycling. I wanted to say one other thing though. Sure. I hardly ever take out my garbage now. I mean, the garbage is much less because I'm putting my food scraps into the compost.
Right, between composting and recycling.
Right, exactly. And that makes a big difference too.
Sure does, yeah, for sure. Question for Kate. Is Wilmette considering partnering with collective resource like other towns like Evanston or Morton Grove or Skokie have done to offer year-round residential food waste collection at discounted prices?
I would say that's not something that we're actively pursuing right now, just because we're in the middle of, well, actually getting towards the tail end of our current contract with Waste Management. That goes through 2023. So I would say, right now it's included in all of the fees that our residents are currently paying. And like Linda said, you can continue to collect the compost over the winter.
Right.
Just it's something that you just have to keep, and it will freeze. It really, in terms of volume, I would say the lawn clippings are going to take up the most volume in your container. So if you are collecting it over the winter, you probably have enough room for that in your container.
Good point.
But I will say everything is on the table come 2023.
Oh, exciting. Okay. Question for Mike. I think people are sometimes a little afraid of getting the worms involved. So for people who are interested in vermicomposting, what are your top 2 to 3 recommendations for getting started?
I think if you, I don't want to, pitch the garden tower too hard, but I think that's what finally convinced me to try it. I was always interested, but the other method of using worms is just basically to get a big bin and throw everything together. And I found the garden tower to have, I think, 2 advantages. One, the worms are a little more out of sight, out of mind. And 2, it's a little more forgiving because the worms can move into the soil around the plants. They're not stuck in the center. And I've heard horror stories of the compost going bad and the worms don't like it in there, and they all will just come right out of the bin into someone's kitchen floor or basement floor. So having the tower where the worms can live a little bit more of a natural life was what sold it for me. Also, the worms in the finished compost, the worms tend to leave that area. So you don't, once in a while I would see some in there and have to pick them out, which isn't real fun. But most of the time they leave that because it's not very nutritious anymore. And I also found lately the best way to get them out of there is if I see some worms in the finished compost, I just pile it up on top of the tower, on top of the soil that's in there, and they will just naturally migrate. They don't like being in light, and they don't like being dried out. So they will evacuate the finished compost and go back into the tower if you let them. And I think those are my suggestions for minimizing the contact with the worms.
Oh, that's smart. That's a good idea. And while I have you on, how often do you store your compost?
Not that often. As I said, I don't try to make it hot, and I don't aerate it. I think the standard rule of thumb is once a week to turn it over. I think it probably gets a little air just from my little digging with the trowel and burying the scraps. I would say maybe one every couple of months. I do towards the end of the summer. I kind of eyeball how much material I have, and that's when I maybe throw a lot of browns in, and I sort of have to stir everything up to get those mixed in. And I will put some leaves in the fall if I have a batch that's almost finished, and I think it can take some more browns. The leaves tend to break down over the winter pretty well, even though it's cold. So I don't do it that often. I do moisten it, especially with the lid. I have a solid lid on there so it doesn't get rain. And I think it's more important to keep it moist to keep these processes going than it is to stir it up.
Okay, that's super helpful. And as an addition, Beth would like to note that a pitchfork works way better than a trowel to.
Yes. Yeah. And I do use a pitchfork when I'm doing serious turning.
Some serious turning, got it. And then Beth also says that there are some specialized compost tools that work very well, but are also fun to use. So that's kind of exciting.
I have a follow-up question for Mike, if I may jump in there. Excuse me, Maria. So Mike, can you tell us a little bit about how you manage the tower in winter? How do you keep the worms from freezing?
Oh, that's a good question. I did not include that in my talk, but So I actually wheel that thing into the house, and it's very heavy because it's full of soil. It weighs a couple 100 pounds. But we have sliding patio doors at the back of our house that lead off the deck. And I just roll it into the family room. There's a floor to ceiling windows. I cut all the plants out, that we're growing in the summer that are left that we haven't eaten. And I just roll the thing into the family room. I leave it near the window. It is possible to grow a couple herbs, over the winter, like oregano and things. And they just keep putting kitchen scraps in all winter long. There's no smell, there's no bugs. It works very well. I don't have to go outside quite as often to get rid of the scraps in the winter because they're going into the worms. But some people say they can leave them out all winter, and the worms will sort of, find a spot where they're able to survive, even in this climate.
That's pretty cool. Linda, have you any other follow-up questions?
Well, I do actually, I have one for Arlene, and I'm wondering if given your position in the industry, are you aware of perhaps any pending or legislation either at the county, or state level that might actually force communities to keep food waste out of landfills?
So that is not on the table for Illinois. It is sometimes talked about, and we're trying to coordinate through the Illinois Food Scrap Coalition about keeping the infrastructure of the composting sites growing, so that when Illinois is ready for a food ban, like when they ban the yard waste from the landfill, then the infrastructure will be there. Currently, we would really be not in a good position across Illinois, and Chicagoland definitely by far has more infrastructure, but we definitely do not have enough. So we are really supporting other compost sites opening that do accept or will accept food scraps.
Well, good to know. Well, thank you for that.
Okay. I have a question for both Arlene and Kate. And the question is about cost, because I think that sometimes is a concern for people when it comes to getting started with composting. So Arlene, you can go first. How much does it cost? And I know that Collective Resource has a couple different options, but can you talk a little bit about the cost?
Yeah, thank you. So the 5-gallon bucket service for a weekly pickup is $10.50. And if you want to keep the bucket for every other week, then it's $15.50. And that's not our franchise pricing. The franchise pricing, that drops down about 40% in the communities where we're the exclusive container swap hauler. And then our 32-gallon tote is $24 per swap out. And so it doesn't matter how long you keep it. It's $24 if we come every week, it's $24 a week, or then every other week, it's still $24 each time we come for a pickup. If there's a restaurant or a larger business where we collect more containers, there's price breaks. And if there are 2 buckets in one location, the second bucket is $5.50 per pickup. We also offer a 10% discount for anyone who pays for an annual subscription, no matter which program they're in or how many containers they have. We offer that 10% discount for the annual and 5% for a quarterly payment. And yeah, we have a lot of systems in place to make that very easy. E-check, ACH, or you can set it up through your bank with Zelle, and we send out invoices depending on the system that you would like to have, you know, if you, however you want to pay.
Definitely.
So
If I could just to follow up on that, both for like for instance, Junia's building, it seems to be very cost effective because you have a whole bunch of residents essentially just sharing the one toter. And I know you also have a neighborhood program where essentially it's the same thing. Homeowners can get together, you know, one person would host the tote, so to speak, but you can get multiple people adding into that. And those are really, I think, very cost effective ways to participate in a collection service.
right, there's also a discount on the tote program in the municipal franchise agreements. So, yeah, it is a great way. And we actually have gotten a couple of retail spaces that are accepting up to 5 gallons for $5 for people to feed into the bins at Backlot Coffee on Central Street, at the Evanston Rebuilding Warehouse. There's 2 more, but I can't think of what they are right now. And we're expanding those. I mean, we would love to set those up throughout Chicagoland. So, yeah.
Really quick, Kate, before you talk about the curbside price, Earlene, we have a request for you to show the countertop composting behind you.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, so this is, we sell these, it's just $10 through Collective Resource. I've actually, one of my team actually has delivered it to Beth Drucker, sometimes with the wooden food that we have in it for when we do displays, and she's had to give me the food back. Yeah, so yeah, these are for sale through Go Green Wilmette or through Collective Resource. We can get those to you.
Beautiful. Okay, Kate, curbside prices.
Yep. So curbside, like I said, the toters are free to rent. You just need to call us to arrange for, a drop off if you don't have one already. And then the smaller containers, which I think the size that Linda was showing, that's 1 yard waste sticker per collection. And those are $2.25 each. And then the larger 96 gallons, which we really only recommend for households that are also doing lawn clippings, because that is what's going to take up the volume of that container. Those are 3 stickers per collection.
Okay. Which the math there is obviously not in my brain.
It is $6.75, I believe.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yep.
Great. And then Junia, a question for you. I had asked if you would do anything different if you were going to do it again. But what I did not ask was how it happened and how everyone did get on board and what kind of the process was that you all went through to get composting for your building.
Well, when we told people that they had to have their disposals removed, then explained why, of course, we then were able to broach the idea of composting, how easy it would be and so forth. And we did it through email and letters and board meetings and just all kinds of stuff. And I just demonstrated it all the time.
Was it driven by the board or was it more
It was driven by me. I'm an environmentalist. And I happen to have been on the board at that time as well. So I just pushed it and everybody agreed. And
so your advice for other multi-unit buildings would be to have somebody really pushing it and really
yes, I think so. And I didn't mention that the association pays the fee, which is, as Earlene says, is $24 a week. I mean, it's just nothing, and it's really worth it to us to do that too.
Yeah.
Yes, and I mean the board has to get onto it, of course. And we don't have a doorman, we don't have a live-in manager or anything like that. But we have a manager, and they were very much in favor of it as well. So if you get the right people saying yes, and you start small, and then gradually it grows. Every high rise is different, and ours is fairly small. Some of the larger ones, I have spoken with some people at those places, and there are different configurations of elevators and garages and so forth. So each one has to do it according to what works for them.
Sure.
But I don't think it's impossible. I think it makes a big difference. And there's so much important information now about climate change that I think people are suddenly saying, wait, what can I as an individual do? And one of the things that everybody can do is compost their food waste.
Absolutely. No, that's agreed. You and I are on the same page.
Right.
Mike, a question for you. How much of a time commitment is it for you to manage your 3-bin compost system? About how many hours per week during the summer would you say you spend on it? And then I would ask the same question for the vermicompost.
I think working from home, I tend to use it as a way of procrastinating. So I probably spend a little more time than I need to, just kind of looking at it and poking around in it. But it's not really a much of a commitment at all once it's going. You know, as I said, I like to take everything out at least, you know, once a day because I don't want things composting in my bucket in the kitchen. So it's just a few minutes to go and toss everything out after dinner at the end of the day before it gets dark. I'm throwing the green things that I'm pulling out of the yard in there. That's just, doesn't really take any more time than throwing them anywhere else. So that's not really a commitment. I would say the biggest amount of time is spent, you know, in the spring when I'm, you know, digging out the batch of compost and spreading it in my yard or putting it in my raised beds, and then cutting down the plant material that I've left overwintering. But again, that's not really part of the composting. That would have to be done anyway. So once it was built and set up and it's up and running, it really is a very, you know, the way I do it without turning it every week and everything and really trying to generate large batches, it's really a very low commitment. The same with the garden tower. I think I'll maybe remove the worm castings once every 6 weeks, and again throw, you know, I'll toss in kitchen scraps every day or so. I try to give the worms the choicer bits, and we use it to grow our greens, and so, you know, we spend time you know, picking our salads and picking our herbs before we cook, and that's really about it. And again, then wheeling it in and out of the house takes a little bit of an effort.
Okay, that's exciting. That seems manageable.
Very manageable.
Last question, I believe, for tonight will go to Arlene. Have you seen an increase in demand for your services with COVID, or if not within the last few years, but with COVID specifically, as more people were cooking at home and dining in, do you think that trend will continue, or what do you see as the future of composting?
So it definitely continues to grow. And one of the things that we saw as people realized that they were home more, they had a little bit of time because they weren't commuting into the office, a lot of people working at home, like Mike, and then they're cooking more, and they're like remembering, I've been meaning to sign up for a composting service. So initially we had a huge explosion of residential business, which was great because we had 50 schools close and stop composting all in one day, you know, when the governor shut that down. And then we had 200 other commercial sites, most of which completely shut down. So then there was just the uptake of the residential, which was really nice. But we went from diverting 38 tons a week, and now we're recovering back up to about 20, but we were all the way down to 12 tons a week. As COVID went on and more people were struggling with finances, and then a lot of people had to give up the service. They either were giving it up because their budgets couldn't afford it, or they were combining households, you know, that they weren't maintaining their own apartment, or all of a sudden it was needed that parents needed to go and live by where younger families were with little kids to help with the childcare, so there was a lot of combining of households. So that definitely had an effect too. But, we're steadily growing, where we have 2,800 customers now. And, and thanks. I saw your eyebrows. That was nice. And so the other part of that is the businesses are coming back. And
Right.
so we're getting a lot of conversations about that, and more of the restaurants are getting busy, with the restrictions lifting. And
Right.
some restaurants actually were able to keep it going through COVID, but it is an expense that is different than the landfilling expenses. So yeah, so it evolves, but it's always gone up.
That's
I
exactly
think the one other thing I'd like to add to that is the consciousness is definitely growing.
right.
Like, 11 and a half years ago, when I started talking about I was going to start a composting service, people had no idea what I was talking about at all. Most people just kind of thought, she's a little crazy. But now, people really understand, there's a lot more conversation about how important it is to mitigate climate change. There's a lot more conversation about commercial composting, where you can divert 100%. And then there's a lot of conversation about the convenience of that we bring the fresh container every time to help keep the ball rolling.
That's
So,
super.
yeah, so it's definitely always growing very
what-
organically.
Good. One super, super fast question for Mike. Mike, speed round. Somebody was asking if that they don't have access to collective resource when they go to Northern Michigan in the summer, and they regret tossing their kitchen scraps in the trash. So they're thinking of getting a tumbler to compost, and they're wondering if they can get compost out of it by September if they start in May with leaves, yard waste, and kitchen scraps.
Boy, that's I really don't have any experience with using a tumbler. I think maybe someone else on the panel might have. I thought maybe, but I can't say that it can go very fast if you have a hot mix. Looks like does somebody else have an answer?
Yeah, I could jump in here a little bit. So with tumblers, you really need to have two of them going, because if you keep adding the raw food scraps into the tumbler, you're never going to have completely finished compost.
Right.
So I think that if you were to fill for May and June and maybe July, and then stopped adding to that particular tumbler, but kept turning it, I think it's possible by September you would have a material that would be broken down enough to go into your garden.
Awesome.
But then that second bin, you wouldn't really be able to use until the spring. So, yeah.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you for that answer. And Linda, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right, well, we're just about out of time, and I want to thank all of our speakers again. Thank you so much, for spending 90 minutes with us today, and for, answering all our questions and sharing all this wonderful information on your services or the practices that you use. I think it's been really helpful. And I hope to our audience that you've been inspired to either start composting or to continue to do what you're doing, and maybe even increase the amount and kind that you do. So again, this webinar has been recorded. We will send you a link to it when it is posted to our site, and you can go back and review it should you wish. And with that, I thank you all again, and everyone have a good night.